Welcome to Learning Photography with Duck. Here's your host, Duck.
Hello everybody, and welcome once again to another edition of Learn Photography with Duck. I am your host, Duck, and today's session is on Photoshop. But before we get into our lesson today, I just wanted to remind people that this coming Saturday, I am doing a off-camera flash photography workshop in New Haven. This is in conjunction with Robert Fiedler of the Hartford Amateur Photography Group. He's been wanting to get back into doing live workshops, and now that the COVID vaccine has rolled out and social distancing is starting to ease up a little bit, we're going to be doing our first workshop of the year, and hopefully we'll schedule a couple more similar workshops as the weather gets warmer. So if you're interested in learning how to use your flash, basically your speed light, in an off-camera configuration, this is definitely going to be the workshop for you. It's this Saturday from 10 in the morning till about 2 in the afternoon. We're going to be meeting in New Haven, and we have 2 models lined up for the day. I'm going to be bringing 2 strobist kits so that we can split up into 2 groups, and each group will basically have autonomous control over their model, and then we'll be switching models and setups and backgrounds throughout the day. So this is a paid event. We have to pay the models, and Robert's handling all that. But you can go on the Learn Photography with Duck Facebook page, and there is a link for the event there. Or if you're familiar with Robert, you can just contact Robert, make arrangements to pay for the workshop with him. And hopefully we'll see you on Saturday. We've got about 3 seats left, so they're starting to really go now. Okay. It is it's going to be a small group. We're limiting it to 8 photographers. So there's going to be 10 of us. No, there's going to be 12 of us. So 8 photographers, Robert and myself, and then the 2 models. So that means that we can work in very small groups without everybody being on top of each other. So if you've ever been to workshops where they just got way too many people and you really don't learn anything, I'm definitely avoiding that. I hate those type of workshops because you really don't learn anything. So anyway, that's my little spiel. So Saturday, April 17th. Carol, I know you signed up, and I put a link on my Facebook event page. I put a link to a Google Doc that kind of explains what we're doing for the day. So just click on the link. It'll open it up for you, okay? And if anybody else is interested in what I have lined up, go ahead and take a look at the document, okay?
So the only thing we have to bring is our camera and our external flash.
Bring your camera and a good portrait lens. I will have the flashes and the triggers. However, there are some cameras that don't like to work with pocket wizards, in particular some older Sony cameras. So that's the only caveat to that whole thing. So if you have an older Sony camera that does not connect well with pocket wizards, then you might want to bring your own flash, so that way your flash will trigger the off-camera flash. Or if you want to learn specifically how to use your particular flash, then in that case, we just swap yours out and you can use it. If you have a radio trigger for your flash, I suggest you bring it. That way you get used to working with your equipment. But if you don't have it, you don't need to bring it. I will have, like I said, I'm going to be bringing 2 Strobus kits, one for each group. So, okay. All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen to do, where am I? This one, share. Okay. What we're going to be doing today is going over the blend modes. Going over the blend modes in Photoshop. Blend modes are, for one, they're pretty powerful effects that you can apply to your images, but they can also be very frustrating because sometimes it's hard to understand what is happening with the particular blend mode. I'm going to be upfront and tell you that I still struggle trying to know which blend mode does which. I have a pretty good grasp on the ones that I use the most often, and I will share those with you towards the end. But I do have my notes, and I'm going to go down each one by one and kind of give you a look at what each blend mode does. And if you're interested, I'm going to go a little bit into the math behind the blend modes. So sometimes understanding the math behind it kind of helps understand what is happening within the image. And of course, I'll give out a few hints to try to remember some of these blend modes and how they operate. Okay. All right. Let me switch over to Photoshop, and I have a very simple document here. It's basically a color chart with RGB. I'm not going to get overly complicated with the colors here because I want you to be able to see the effect fairly clearly. And if you notice that I have a gradient going from dark all the way on the left-hand side to white all the way on the right-hand side. All right, so we have black on the left, white on the right, and then a variation of luminosity on red, green, and blue. All right, so the primary channels. I'm not even going to worry about the secondary channels because I think you'll get an understanding of this. Above that layer, I just have a simple grayscale. Okay, so this way you'll be able to really see what each blending effect does without, like I said, without getting too complicated. Okay. All right, let me pull up my notes because I know if I try to do this off the top of my head, I'm going to really mess it up. Now, if at any point I lose you and you need something explained, don't be shy. Give out a shout, okay? All right. The first mode is the normal mode. Or actually, let me even back up before that. Blend modes or layer blend modes are located in your layer stack. They are located right here, right above your layer stack. And it's basically this little pull down menu. Okay. And the nice thing about it is that, and this is why I have a hard time remembering some of these, because it'll give you a preview of what each one of these effects does live on your work area. So in essence, you don't need to remember these, but having a basic understanding kind of allows you to get to the blend mode that you need a little bit faster without having to scroll down each and every one of those effects, if you know what I mean. Okay. All right. So the first one, as you see right here, is normal mode. Okay. And this is the default mode for any layer that create, and basically means that what you see is what you get. There is absolutely no blending whatsoever between this layer and any subsequent layer below it. Okay. Now, right next to where it's the blend mode, you're also going to see a couple other little, why does this keep popping up? You're going to see a couple other little drop downs. One says opacity, and the one below it says fill. Opacity and fill. All right. And both of these will have a different effect on your layer effect, depending on the type of layer effect. And I'll be going over that in a little bit, because there are, as you can see, there are a lot of layer effects, okay? But only 8 of these are what are called special layer effects that behave a little bit differently with the fill versus the opacity. Okay. Now, what is opacity and what is fill? If you've ever played with any of these, you may have noticed that they kind of both behave similarly. So, for example, if I take the opacity down to about, 50%, halfway, you're going to see that the underlying color starts coming through. That's because the opacity controls the transparency of the pixels of the layer that is active. All right. So this is my active layer. The grayscale layer is my active layer. All right. And I have applied an opacity of 45%. So I've made it 45% transparent. Okay. Or rather, reverse that, 45% opaque, because 100% opaque means you can't see through it, and 0% opaque is 100% transparent. Okay. So at about 50%, we're only seeing 50% translucency, which allows the underlying layer to come through. Now, if I bring that back up to 100, make it completely opaque, and I go to the fill, and I do the same thing with the fill, you're going to say, well, it looks the same. Because what it's doing is it's applying a 50% transparency or 50% opacity to the layer. And you're saying, well, okay, if it's applying 50% opacity with the fill, and the opacity slider also does a 50% opacity to the layer, what is the difference? The difference comes into play when you apply a layer effect. A layer effect. And that's, if you go down to the bottom, you see that little FX window. Okay. Any of these effects, all right, and you'll notice this little dialog window pops up. When you apply any of these, all right, these do not get affected by the fill. All right. So let me just give you an example. Let me return this back to 100. Okay. Let me change this back to the default. All right. Actually, let me just disable layer effects. Oh, come on. Oh, never mind. All right, I'm going to take excuse me. Put in a text. Let's see. Nothing too. Let's do 500. Oh, that might be a little bit too big. Let's do 300. What the heck? Oh no! I lost Photoshop. It shut down on me. Sorry about that, guys.
Looks pretty cool on my desktop.
Heavy, man, heavy.
Photoshop crashed and burned on me.
It's a good thing I'm not on drugs right now.
Oh my god, oh my god. Oh, here we go, all right.
I had 4 cups of coffee today. Okay, I got my drugs.
Okay, we're back. Okay. Let's see. Let's go. Let's go. There we go. Hello. Something simple. Oh. Okay. And we'll make this. Okay. Yeah, that way we'll make it really stand out there. Okay. So we have text here, and we have, you know, this light color applied to it. Okay. All right, white color. And now if I take the opacity down on the word hello, all right, you're going to notice that it starts disappearing. It's becoming transparent. Okay. If we do the same thing with the fill, it does the same thing. It starts becoming transparent. So we've already covered this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a layer effect on it. And the easiest way is to just, if you double click anywhere on the layer here, it's going to bring up the dialog box. Okay. And these are all the effects that you can play on, that you can put on it. So what I'm going to do is, let's put in a drop shadow. That tends to be, you know, a popular thing that people do. All right, so we're going to put our drop shadow. We're going to increase the distance, increase the spread a little bit, the size. Okay, and we'll make it really stand out. All right, everybody can see the shadow, right? Okay, now we have a layer that has a color, and we have a layer that also has an effect. Okay, so now if I select that layer and I use my opacity slider, all right, I'm going to bring it down to really low. Okay, you're going to notice that both the color, the fill of the words, and the shadow have now become transparent. Okay, pretty obvious. All right, we're going to bring that back up to 100. However, if I use the fill slider and I bring that down, you will notice that only the fill of that layer becomes transparent, the effect does not get touched. All right, so that in essence is the difference between opacity and fill. So if you've ever been confused about what the difference is, here it is. Okay. All right. Let me get rid of that because we don't need it anymore. Okay. Now, there are 8 special layer blend modes that behave differently between opacity and fill. To be honest, I don't think I've ever run into any normal editing that I've ever done that I've needed one of those special blend modes to behave in any particular way. But I'm sure there is a need for it somewhere because Adobe put it in there. Okay. All right. So we've already covered the first blend mode, and that's the normal, that's the default. Okay. And if we look at our stack here, you're going to notice that this drop down is grouped into sections, right? So you see normal at the top, and then you'll see dissolve, and then there's a line. Then you'll see another group of effects, and then a line or a break, and then another group, a break, another group, a break, another group, and a break. Okay? This is done on purpose because, why is this keep popping up? Because each one of those groups handles the effect in a similar way. The only thing is that there's slight differences between each one within that group. So for example, the first group you see is normal and dissolve. Normal and dissolve. Okay. All right, let me bring that back up to 100. And normal obviously does not apply any kind of blend between its layer and the one below it. But the dissolve does. But the dissolve only works when a opacity or a fill effect is added to it. Okay, so by itself it's going to behave just like a normal mode. Okay, but as soon as you start applying either opacity, let me put a 50%, you're going to notice that it's starting to, oh, where's my zoom? There it is. It puts this kind of like grain effect. All right. And the more opacity I add, the more translucency I add to it, the finer that grain becomes and more of that background you're able to see. So if you've ever done any kind of video work and you've seen a dissolve in video, this is pretty much what it is. It's just doing a dissolve from one to the other. Okay. Does it have any application in normal editing? Probably not, unless you're into doing some animation stuff. Let me get my layers back in order here. If you do anything with animating in the timeline, this is a way of doing dissolve transitions. Okay, pretty simple. The next group is what is called the Darken Group. So all these layers in this group will darken your main image in one way, shape, form, or another. Okay. Now, one little tip that I will point out right here is if you notice the first layer effect in each one of these groups, it's going to give you a hint as to what that group does. All right. So the first one is normal. The second one is darken. The third group is lighten. and it will obviously lighten your image. The other ones are a little bit not as clear. This one with the overlay is actually a contrast effect. Then we have this one's kind of like a combination of a couple things. And then finally we have the hue saturation. And I'll break those down later on. But right now, the more popular groups is the first three: the darken, the lighten, and the overlay. Okay, I'm not going to consider normal as part of it because that's the default. But the first three groups: darken, lighten, and overlay. Those are pretty much the three most common ones that you will be using. Okay, so we're going to look at darken. And what darken does is it takes the pixels of your layer, your active layer. Come on. Takes the pixels of your active layer, and it says, okay, is the pixel on the active layer darker or lighter than the pixel on the underlying layer? All right, ask that question first. If the answer is the active layer is darker than the pixel on the bottom layer, it's going to keep it. All right, it's going to keep that dark layer, that dark pixel. However, if the pixel of the active layer is lighter than the underlying layer, it will replace it with the underlying layer. So in essence, what we're doing is we're kind of preserving the dark tones. Okay. And if we look at, we'll go back to darken and then normal. All right. You'll notice that the underlying colors are now starting to come through and intermixing with the grayscale layer above it. So now if I turn off that grayscale, you'll notice that as soon as I turn it off, all these colors are much brighter. Okay, because the luminosity of the grayscale layer above it is darker. Okay, and you'll notice that the white is not being affected because obviously the white of the layer on top is the same as the white on the layer below it. So it's not going to have any effect. There's no change there. Likewise with the black. Black is black. You can't get blacker than black. So there's not going to be effect. But you'll notice that everything else will darken. Yes.
When you're dealing with multiple layers, is there something you need to do so that it only looks at, you're comparing 2 layers or 3 layers?
All right.
So what it looks like, whether it's going to darken it or not? I ask that because I know in the past you've done some things where you've done something where you link 2 layers together, so the activity is only constrained to those 2 layers.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. I see what you mean. Okay. Well, first of all, you have to understand. Let me take a backward step here for 1 second. Okay. I mentioned earlier that I'm using a very simplified color chart here. Okay. And I'm doing this on purpose so you can kind of see what the effect is. All right. What you're going to find is that in the real world, determining what is darker or lighter in one layer becomes a little bit trickier because oftentimes we are not working with a grayscale on top. Okay, we're not working with, shades of black and white. Okay, we're normally dealing with some kind of color information, right? So it becomes a little bit trickier. However, when you understand the fundamentals of that, after a while of working with some of these layer effects, you can start kind of anticipating what the look is that you're going to get. All right. And overall, what happens is that little bit of information becomes part of your toolbox of things that you can keep in the back of your head for when you are editing. All right. So, for example, here's one example we've done in the past. You shot a landscape, and you want to control some of the lighting effect in your landscape. You want to bring attention to a certain part of your landscape, and you want to kind of subdue other parts. So what do we do in this particular situation? We do dodge and burn. Okay. What is dodging and what is burning? Well, burning is darkening specific areas of an image, while dodging is lightening certain specific parts of an image. Okay, so right now, all of a sudden, if you understand the fundamentals of dodge and burn, now you can say, okay, well, I'm going to need something that darkens, and I'm going to need something that lightens. So now when you go to your layer stack and you need to create your dodging and burning, you can say, oh, well, here I have a darken layer, and here I have a lighten layer. All right. So now you have two tools that you can use for your dodging and burning right off the bat without, really doing any mental gymnastics. Okay. Obviously, there are better tools for dodging and burning than just the darken and lighten, but having that little bit of information already gets you in the ballpark. All right. And now you build on your knowledge base a little bit more, and you say, okay, well, this particular tool is best for dodging. This particular tool is best for burning. For example, the multiply layer is better for burning, and the screen layer is better for dodging. Okay, so now you've added something to your toolbox because you understand the basic fundamentals behind what a darken layer does and what a lighten layer does. All right. So hopefully that answers your question in one part. The other part is, okay, in your layer stack, all right, no, let me back that up. In my layer stack here, I only have 2 layers. So it's very simplistic. When we're editing, we end up having multiple layers. We'll have curves, we may have levels, we may have God knows what, okay? So anything that you add above it is going to affect the composite of everything below it. So for example, I have my base layer and I add a curves adjustment to bring up the shadows. And I have another curves adjustment to bring down the highlights. All right. So these are global kind of lighting effects. Okay. So now I have 3 layers. I have my base layer and I have 2 curves adjustments. Now, on top of that, I decide I'm going to apply a darken layer. Okay. Well, that darken layer is going to affect the composite of those 3 layers below it. Okay. So hopefully that answered that question. As far as limiting, yeah, you can lock the effect to just the layer below, and you can do that just by limiting, or here I'll show you. Actually, I'll pull up a curves adjustment. Okay, and this little icon right here. Okay, why? Something's going on here. All right, that little icon right there, okay, will lock it to the layer below. All right, so this, whatever effect this does, will only affect the layer immediately below it. Okay, otherwise it'll do the composite effect. Okay. All right. But you got to realize that that layer may be a composite effect. Yeah, I know. It can be complicated. Hopefully I did not just fry brains way too early, because we got a lot to cover. Okay. All right.
You're doing good, Duck. We're completely lost.
I knew it.
This kid.
Okay. All right, so first layer is darken, okay? And basically I just wanted you to notice that it pretty much linearly darkens everything below it, all right? So here I have a very light, actually let me go ahead and duplicate this layer and make it my normal, okay? This is a very, very, very light gray. All right, so it's going to have a very, very, very light effect on the layer below it. Okay, so if we turn that off, you notice that it barely, almost imperceptibly, did anything to that layer. Okay. Simply because the math is so ever so slight. Where you do notice it is more in the dark tones. All right. That said, one thing that I want you guys to pay attention to as we progress further into these is something that I've touched upon in the past, and that is that 50% medium gray division. All right. Anything from middle gray to white or middle gray to black. Okay. In this particular case, you'll notice that everything from middle gray to black is a lot more noticeable of an effect than from middle gray to light. Okay. All right. Next one is multiply. It's very similar to darken. It just adds a little bit more oomph to it, especially in the dark tones. Okay. This is, a lot of people will use the multiply mode for doing their burning, simply because it really, really amplifies the shadows. Okay. But you notice that if the underlying colors are already kind of dark, it's really going to push it into blacks. So this is going to give you a little bit more of a contrast, luminosity contrast in the shadows if you're not careful. All right. So depending on what it is that you want to do, you might want to select either darken or multiply. Okay. All right. The next one is color burn. Okay. And when we talk about dodging and burning, those of you who have, done any kind of darkroom stuff with film, you know that dodging is where you place some kind of blockage between the paper and the light that's generating the image. And what that does is it prevents that light from reaching the paper in certain areas, effectively making it a little bit lighter in relation to everything else because the white of the paper is allowed to come through. Inversely, when you burn it, you're actually allowing more light to affect the paper and in essence turning it towards black. Okay, so we have kind of the same thing here, but when we're dealing with color, one thing you have to be careful of is you're also going to start getting a saturation of color, because you have to understand that digitally, what we are doing here is we are applying a darkening to all three layers, the red channel, the blue channel, and the green channel, which in essence, they are all grayscale images. Okay, so even though we are darkening or lightening individual grayscale images, the combination of the three gives us our color. And because they're going to be burned or burned or dodged slightly different layers depending on which channel you're on, you can get an oversaturation. So this is one of those layers that you have to be very, very careful with if you don't want to really just create crazy, crazy colors. Okay, but the color burn is one of those very special 8 layers that I mentioned earlier, that the opacity, all right, behaves differently than the fill. Okay, the opacity and the fill behave slightly different. Okay, so does it matter? Probably not, because to be honest, I don't think I've ever really used the color burn all that much. Okay, because if you notice, this is one of those effects where everything from middle gray to white is not affected. Okay, so does it have its uses? Yeah, if you really, really want to preserve all your mid-tones to the whites and you only want to touch, everything from just beyond mid-tone to the darks, this is a great one. And then you would just control the intensity by controlling the opacity of that effect. All right, but if you notice that on its own, it really, really, really just pushes those shadows into a lot more contrast than the previous one. All right, so here's multiply. You can see that halfway here, we're still getting shadow with detail. And if we go to the darken, we get shadow with detail almost to the very end here. But as soon as we go to our color burn, all that shadow detail gets lost. So this is going to create a lot more contrast. Okay. Next one down is linear burn, and you can see that the contrast gets even deeper, and we are now starting to affect our midtones. All right. We're not really affecting the whites, but we're affecting the midtones, and our shadows have pretty much gone to black. Okay. Again, you would control the intensity with your opacity or your fill. Okay, and if you notice with the fill, as I go down the line, it starts bringing detail in the shadow a band at a time. Okay. Whereas if I do it with the opacity, all right, it does it more linearly across from middle gray to black. All right. So this is a prime example of what I mean by the opacity and the fill behave differently with these special 8s. Okay. All right. The last one here is darker color. Darker color. And basically, in essence, this is kind of similar to the darken mode that we had at the very beginning, but the but the darkness is on the composite channel instead of separate RGB channels. All right. So I think I may have mentioned it. Darken applies the math on the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel independently. Whereas darker color applies it on the luminosity of all 3 channels. Okay, so you'll notice that this particular darkening is probably the least obvious. It's the most subtle of the 3. So you're going to really preserve a lot of that shadow detail, but you're just going to give it that little extra oomph. Okay? All right. The next set that we're going to discuss is our lighten set. Lighten set. Okay? And of course, we start off with the lighten. And the one thing you're going to notice here is once you learn what one particular group, or in this case, what the Darken group does, all you have to do is for the Lighten group, think in reverse, because it literally does the opposite of what the Darken and Multiply and the Burn effects does. So the Lighten basically takes the the active layer, all right, channel by channel, and says, okay, is this pixel lighter or darker? All right. Is it lighter or darker? Okay. If it is lighter, it's going to keep it. If it is darker, it's going to take the lighter one from underneath and bring it forward. Okay. So you're going to get an overall lightening effect. Okay. And if we notice, one thing I want you to pay attention to here is how the saturation of the colors has gone down. Okay. Just like, actually, let me do the darken mode. If we notice the saturation has dulled with the darken mode on these, we're going to get a similar result where the saturation shifts with the lighten mode. Okay. But overall, it lightens everything. It does not affect black, and it does not affect white. Okay. The next mode is probably one of the more popular ones, and that's the screen mode. Screen mode. Okay. And what you'll notice is that it really affects more of the highlights and midtones than it does the shadow area. All right. So it's just a little bit more intense than the lighten mode, but going from middle gray towards white. Whereas the multiply really darkened it from the middle grays to the shadows. This one is, again, just think the opposite. Next one is color dodge. And you'll notice that the contrast in the highlights is definitely a lot greater. We're losing a lot more detail in the lights, okay? But it's really not affecting our darks, all right? But it is affecting our midtones a lot more, okay? So basically everything just shifted over away from that white into the shadows, all right? In effect, what you're doing is you're overexposing your image, all right? But you're also pushing the saturation. So just like the color burn, you have to watch out for that saturation of color. Then we have our linear dodge, which pushes it even further. All right. And again, these are, what do you call it? Two of our special 8s, where the opacity, all right, the opacity and the fill behave differently. All right, so I want you to pay attention to, all right, I'm going to bring this down. I want you to pay attention to how this light area of the white progresses to each stage as I bring it back. All right, notice that it goes like strip at a time. So it's really just brightening up those highlight areas to beyond recoverable. Okay. Last one is a lighter color. Okay, lighter color. This is similar to the light and blend mode, but it lightens on a composite, meaning it takes all the channels into consideration as a single unit rather than splitting them up. Okay, and you're going to notice that it did something strange in this particular example, where it allowed the green to come through, and that's because on the luminosity scale, green is a lot lighter than the gray above it. All right. These grays here are actually darker than the luminosity of these green tones. All right. And if you think about it, it makes a little sense, because if we understand the way our camera sensors work, we have twice as many green sensors as we do red and blue sensors. All right. So if your camera has that Bayer sensor, you know that it has color filters in front of it, and you're going to have one red, one blue, and 2 green. All right. So that makes perfect sense as to why this green is coming through, because green is a little bit brighter because it has twice as much information as the corresponding gray. All right, just a little tidbit. All right, so, excuse me. So that's the lighter color. And out of these two, the more popular ones is the multiply and the screen. Okay, multiply and screen. Those are the two that you'll probably use the most out of either one of those two groups. Okay. Then we get into our next group, which is our contrast group. And what this does, why is this different than the previous ones? Well, the Darken Group handled the shadows side of the image, right? And the Lighten Group tackled the highlight section of the colors, all right? And you noticed that as I went down each effect, the contrast in the shadow area got harder with the Darken Group, while the contrast in the light section got more pronounced with the Lighten Group. Okay, this is called a contrast group because what this does is it works more with the midtones in creating contrast to the edges. All right, so the first one is overlay. Okay, and if I toggle this on and off, you're going to see exactly what I mean by being selective with that midtone. If you look at the center part of our, actually, let me turn this off, of our color grid here, I want you to pay attention to these three here in the center, right? And then note the darks and the lights, okay, as I make this active, okay? All right, notice how the contrast increased in the shadows and the highlights, pretty much leaving the midtones alone. All right, so this is one of those where paying attention to that 50% gray works well. Now, overlay is sometimes used by people to do a quick and dirty dodging and burning. All right, and the way you do that, and actually I'll show you here. I'm going to create a new layer. Okay, it's just a new blank layer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill it with 50% gray. Okay, 50% gray. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is change the mode from normal to overlay. All right, and now you're going to notice if I toggle this on and off, it makes absolutely no change to that underlying layer because 50% gray becomes invisible. Now, if I take a brush, I'm going to just take a nice soft round brush. Okay, let me make it bigger here. And why are we beeping? I don't know. All right, and if I take black, okay, for my brush color, okay, and I'm just going to bring my opacity down on my brush to 50%, okay? I'm just going to make a swipe, okay? Notice how it's affecting the shadow and the highlight areas a lot more than the middle, okay? At the either end of that pass that I just made, you can really see my path. But in the center, it's barely imperceptible, okay? Barely imperceptible, all right? It's there because what I've done is I've taken the middle gray and I pushed it to black. All right, so what we're doing is, in effect, we are burning our image. Okay, we're burning our image, but you notice that we're heavier contrast in the shadows and heavier contrast in the highlights. Now, if I take and I make my brush white, okay, and I pass it over, all right, we are now getting away from that middle gray, okay, and we are in essence saying, all right, we're going to replace that underlying layer with the lighter color. Okay. Previously, we replaced it with the darker color. Now what we're doing is we're saying replace it with the lighter color. So the further we get away from that 50% gray, all right, we are really, really pushing the change. We're seeing more contrast towards the highlights and towards the shadows. So this is a quick and dirty way of doing dodging and burning, because what in essence you're doing is you're just switching between a black brush, all right, to burn the area, and a white brush to dodge the areas, okay? Because we're stepping away from that middle gray that gets rendered as invisible. Okay, so there's a nice little trick to learn for when you want to do dodging and burning on a single layer. Okay, create a fill layer, 50% gray, add white or add black, and it's going to lighten or darken your image. All right, but it's going to create contrast in the highlights. All right, and it's going to create contrast in your shadows. All right. Next one down is soft light. Okay, soft light, which is again a little bit more contrasty than our light. And oh no, where was soft light? There we go. All right. Actually, it's a little less contrasty. Excuse me. Okay. So if you want to have a subtler effect with your dodging and burning, and you want to only dodge, really into the deep shadows, create deeper shadows, this is the blend mode to go with. Okay, you're going to have a lot more effect in the extreme ends, right? And you notice that more of that middle tones are not being affected. Okay. Next one down is hard light. And in this case, what we're doing is, excuse me, we are creating heavier contrast. All right. You notice that our shadows are becoming, really heavy with very little detail. Right, and we're really losing our highlights in this section. Okay, but overall, the center part, the middle tones, okay, pretty much being left alone. But we are getting some color contrast in the midtones. All right, so that color contrast is starting to really show up in our midtones. Okay. So it's starting to creep in towards the center. All right. Next one is vivid light. All right. Which is even more progressive. All right. It's really starting to really creep in towards the center. If you notice, just to the left and right of the midtones, we're seeing a more intense effect of the lightening on the light side and the darkening on the dark side. Okay. And then we have our linear light, which is favors more of the highlights than it does the shadow, as you can see here. All right. Now, if you've been paying attention, you notice that as I go down the list, the effect is becoming more intense. More intense. So that's a good little tip to keep in mind. All right. So the linear light, but you notice that, the colors are, they're not getting too crazy. Okay. Linear light, vivid light, linear light, vivid light. Okay. You notice that in the midtones, they're not becoming more saturated, all right, with the linear light. All right, so a lot of people will use linear light for their dodging and burning over something like, for example, overlay or soft light. So again, this depends on what your source image is and how intense the colors are. So for example, if you have something with a lot of intense colors, you may not want to use linear light. However, if you have something, like for example, a landscape where you have more muted colors, then linear light might be the best choice for your dodging and burning, because it's going to bring some of those colors out a little bit more. Okay. And the next one is pin light. Pin light. And actually, I don't know what the difference is, other than it just takes whatever color and just starts darkening it. Let me create a layer, call that pin light. White, oops, black. Okay. Yeah, so it's another another one where it really doesn't do a lot for contrast. Okay. However, if you notice that previous, let me see if I can show you. All right. I'm going to go down these lists. All right. And what I want you to do is I want you in particular pay. Actually, let me see if I can do this. Let me get my brush. I have black. I'm going to paint here. Doesn't matter there. I'm going to switch over to white. I'm going to paint here, and I'm going to paint here. Okay. So I have white here, and I have black here. Okay. Pay attention to how each one of these behaves over pure black and pure white. All right, we have overlay, soft light, hard light. All right, you're going to notice that now it's starting to affect the white and black areas. Vivid light. Okay, now vivid light's doing something a little funky because we have a soft blend going from dark through middle gray into light, okay? And it's taking pretty much everything from that middle gray to light and then just rendering it invisible. And then we get to linear light and pin light. Linear light and pin light. So what it's doing is it's just barely touching into those very, 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 very soft shadows, the light shadows, all right? And on both here and here, okay? So in this particular case, what it's doing is it's affecting the grays in this area if I were to do a gradient. All right, so that's why with this, you're not seeing any effect, because the grays in this are darker than the grays that would be here as we go from this to zero, or from this to white, right? So any very, 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 very light grays, you would notice the effect here. But because I don't have any of that information, we're not seeing any of the effect, all right? So basically, as we're getting into the pin light, it's affecting the contrast on the extreme ends of our luminance scale. All right. And then, of course, we have a hard mix. And then the hard mix is going to render everything to its primary colors and black and white into our shadows, our midtones, and our highlights. Okay, so you notice how everything from this kind of like light gray to white just goes completely white. Anything from this medium dark gray or medium dark tone to black goes completely black. And then the 3 tones in the center that are closest to middle gray just get crushed into that 50% gray, which gets rendered as invisible. All right. All right, so this is probably the most extreme contrast of all, because we just lose all that detail on the 2 ends, and obviously we're losing any kind of effect in the midtones. All right. The next group is a they're split up into 2 different types. Okay, we have, let me get my spelling. We have difference and we have exclusion, which are inversions, meaning they invert the colors. And then we have subtract and divide, which tend to cancel each other out. Okay, and let me explain what I mean by that. All right, so difference basically you get the underlying layer gets subtracted from the active layer. All right, so you subtract pixels from the active layer from anything down below it, but the thing is blacks don't change, they stay at black, and any other color, all right, if there's black completely above it, stays that color, all right, or goes to black. What was it? Blacks don't change any colors because black in the calculation is considered 0, and any other color that's less than 0, all right, will be that color, all right, and whites will automatically drop out to black, okay, because whites are a much larger number, and anything else less than that, okay. So this basically inverts what's underneath, right, and then subtracts one from the other, okay. So we have white, all right, we have our grayscale, we have white that is sitting on top of white. It's going to invert the layer below it, so that white will now become black. Okay, you take white away from black, you're going to get black. In essence, that's the gist of how this works. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, that's kind of a useless thing to have, all right? But there are a couple of actions that I have used in the past that utilize this principle, and they tend to be check layers where I want to check one layer against another. So for example, if I want to check the saturation of a particular color, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of these inversions to see how much above middle gray is that saturation of that color, okay, or how intense that color is, right? So it's a way of kind of controlling the intensity of colors in your image by being able to see how far above normal, I guess you may call it, that color saturation is, okay? I'm not going to get into check layers right now, but it's something that will be coming up. So you will be seeing the subtract and the next one, which is the divide. All right, so this is, this is difference, okay? The exclusion, you'll notice that it does the same thing. It inverts the black to the white to black and the black to white. does the math and renders it as black. But you'll notice that here, the midtones are a little bit different, okay? That's because the math is slightly different in how it handles the midtones. So exclusion and difference. Exclusion, difference. All right. So exclusion is allowing a lot of that color to come through, whereas difference is allowing more of that grayscale to come through. All right. Okay. Subtract. It just subtracts the one layer from the other and displays the results. It also works very much like the difference, okay, where it does that inversion, right? But it handles the math just a little bit differently, all right? Especially if there is color information, right? Because now we can see that there's color coming through, all right? Let's see how. All right, let me explain it this way, okay? Difference pulls preferences off the upper layer, all right? In this case, my top layer is grayscale. Subtract is influenced by the underlying layer. In this case, it has color information, so it's letting that color come through, okay? So they both do pretty much the same thing, except difference favors the active layer while subtract favors the underlying layer. And then last one we have is divide, right? And divide is the one that you'll be seeing with the check layer. It's a great way of checking if there's any change in an image. Because if there's no change in an image, when you divide one copy of the image from itself, it's going to render it black. All right. What do I mean by that? Let me get rid of that. I'm going to make a copy of my color. Okay. So if I turn that off, you can see there's no change because it's a clone. It's a duplicate. Okay. So this black is the same as the black underneath. This white's the same as the white underneath. The red is the same. The green is the same, and so on. You get the point. When I make that into a divide, what it's doing is it's dividing the top from the bottom. All right? And it's returning a 0. Okay? And you're going to notice that, it's the same. All right. And obviously black, it's returning a 1. Black's going to return 0. Anything else is going to return a 1. So it's going to register as white. If I do the same thing with the subtract, what it's doing is it's subtracting the upper layer from the lower layer. And because they're both the same, it's going to return a 0, where 0 is black. All right. So in essence, it's simple math. You take red away from red, you're going to get no red. In our case, is black. Okay. Because we got to understand that we're dealing with luminosity, not necessarily color. Right, so the luminosity of that red is the same as the luminosity of the red underneath it. They cancel each other out. All right, it's like turning off the lights. And I probably just confused the hell out of you guys on that one, didn't I? All right. Last one is our components. Our component. Okay. The first one is hue. And basically what hue does is it takes whatever the color of the layer is of layer A, and it blends it with the luminosity of the layer below it. Okay. So in essence, our top layer, our active layer, has no color, right? So we're taking gray, overlaying it over our bottom layer. So it's basically going to convert everything to gray. Okay. Now, let me return this back to normal. I'm going to make a duplicate, drag that on top. I'm going to do the opposite. So now we have a color layer. All right. Actually, probably not going to see a difference because of the way I have these bars. Oh, I know how to show it to you. Here's the hue. Okay. Hue keeps the color of layer A and blends the luminance and saturation of layer B. But because the luminosity and the saturation are pretty equal, you're not going to see a difference. All right, where is my, let me see if I can show this. If I move this over a little bit. Yeah. Normal, hue. Okay. Yeah, I think I would need to really show it with an image that actually has an image to notice the difference. Probably should have thought of that ahead of time, shouldn't I? Okay. But basically what you're noticing here that we're stripping the color out from the underlying layer because there is no color information here. All right. And the luminosity and values are, because they're stripes, it's not going to showcase it. Sorry, guys. But to be honest, this is one you're not going to use too much unless maybe you do landscapes, okay, and you want to alter the color of something. It's also used in fashion when you want to change the color of skin tone or clothing, right? But you have to be careful because it can really do some really funky stuff. But it's mainly used for changing colors. Okay. The next one is saturation. And in this case, what we're doing is we're taking all the saturation out from the layer below because our top layer is grayscale. It's neutral saturation. Okay. So basically keeps whatever saturation you have of your active layer and preserves that to the lower one. Color keeps the color of the active layer and blends the hue and saturation of the underlying layer. Okay. Which obviously we're using, again, grayscale. All right. And then luminosity. Here, the luminosity of the upper, all right. Actually, remember earlier I said how the green sensor, the green, because of the way our sensors are built, tends to be a little brighter. Okay. You can see how that interplays with this particular one because we're taking the luminosity of that upper layer, okay, which the gray tones, you can see the luminosity is a little bit different in the red and blue channel when I turn this off. See how much vibrancy I get back when I turn it off? All right. That grayscale, because it's not the same luminosity as the underlying color, is really affecting it, except for that green. All right. That green is pretty much almost staying the same. All right. You're going to get a slight shift towards the ends. All right. But not by much. Okay. However, because you're seeing the red and blue shift, it's going to appear like this is shifting a lot more. All right, so it's a little bit of a visual illusion. Okay. All right, now that pretty much covers all of them. And I know I lost you towards the end, but that's okay because the important ones are at the beginning. So hopefully you were paying attention at the beginning.
And then again, you can always use Luminar or Topaz, and you won't have to worry about that.
You know, Doug, I get a kick out of all of these things you can do with Photoshop, and of course, we're going back years and whatever. And as Alan said, you know, you've got all these new toys that all you have to do is click.
Yeah.
It's all trial and error. It's all subjectivity. You go through the blending modes and you choose the right one for the right scene or the right image that you're working with, and that's it. I don't think about everything behind it like you just went through. But
Yeah,
thank
but
you
you know,
very
it's
much. I do appreciate understanding the theory behind it all.
Okay, well,
it's always good to know what's under the hood. It's just like with
Yeah.
HTML. I know what's under the hood, and or another type of computer program where you can do access. And I built my SQL, my whatever in Access. I do my Access thing, and then I click the button to see what it looks like in SQL. It's like, yeah, that's what I want to do. So,
yeah.
Again, you the old way. And
Okay. All right. Let me just touch on what Alan said. And to be fair, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. We just click through, find the one that does what we want it to do. All right. And that's what we use. However, I will make an argument for the fact that, like Bill said, now that you understand what's under the hood, you can say to yourself, okay, well, I just clicked on this and it's like really too intense, but the next one down isn't quite where I need it to be. All right. But now that you understand that, well, multiply affects this part of the histogram, and linear light, actually, let me see. How do we do it? All right. So darken affects this much of the histogram, multiply affects this much of the histogram, and linear burn affects this much of the histogram. Okay. Now that I understand that, I can say, well, I don't want to touch this part here. I just want to touch this part here, right? But it looks too intense. So I'm not going to pick that one because it looks wrong. But now that you understand it, you can say, I am going to pick it because it affects the areas that I want. But I'm just going to bring my opacity slider down in order to control it to the point that I want it without having to worry about it affecting the other parts of that histogram that I want to protect. All right, so that's where understanding the little nuances comes into play. All right, sure, you know, understanding the math, who cares? All right, I understand the math and I don't pay attention to the math. All right, because when I'm working visually. Okay. However, I do know in the back of my head, I do know how that math works. And I know that I can manipulate that math in other ways to get the desired result. That's the only thing. All right. Again, it's just adding that, you know, that other screwdriver to your toolbox. But yeah, I got 2 screwdrivers already. Why do I need this third screwdriver? Aha!
No, you're totally correct. So thank Thank you very much, Doc.
No problem. No problem. You know, as with anything, there's the old adage, you don't know what you don't know. And, you know, and a lot of us, that's a hard pill to swallow because we don't want to face the fact that, oh, you know, there's the deficiency in our knowledge, you know. But the thing is, you know, you got to weigh it against the other things that you do know, all right, and say, okay, which one of these is better for the application that I need to put it into work here, all right? Does it fit into my workflow? No? All right, it was nice knowledge to have. Well, I don't need it. Okay? Later on, as your knowledge and your experience broadens and you're now able to critically see your workflow and say, oh, there's a piece here that is lacking. I've come to that part of my understanding that I see that deficiency and it's glaring. Whereas, you know, 2-3 years ago, you had to really beat me over the head in order to point that out to me. Now I definitely see it. And it says, oh, well, I remember that lecture that Duck did about the math of these blend modes that is ringing a bell. Let me revisit that. And you're going to go, aha, there's the screwdriver I need. So that's all. That's all.
As someone who has played extensively with that blend tool and screwed up everything horribly and had no clue why, now I understand better than I did. I don't understand, but better than I did what the hell I was doing.
But that is actually a great way to learn, by really messing up. No, I'm serious.
Except when you're trying to get something done on a bit of a deadline.
Yeah, you're right. That's where the frustration lies. But
yes.
Yeah. So, any questions on anything, Bob? Oh yeah, I just saw Bob wave by.
I was just gonna say, Doug, that you know I was one of those, or have been since 2003, where I just wander in and see what's this tool do and start clicking and dragging, and you know. But I have to say, for someone who's been working with us as long as I have, I finally understand the difference between opaque and fill.
Yes, that was that.
You know, because I used to go through some of those, and you know, not knowing when they would work, I go, well, what the fuck is this for?
Oh yeah, no, it's you're absolutely right. You know, Photoshop is not intuitive by any means. So. Yeah, you know, to be honest, I'm learning it the same way you guys are. All right. There's still a lot of things within Photoshop that I just do not understand. Because one, I hardly use it at this point, you know, in my workflow. Okay. But I have noticed, and this is why what I said to Alan earlier, I'm actually speaking from experience. As I've gone more into photographing people and needing to do, you know, some touch up on people, that workflow is completely different than touching up products. And so I've had to learn some tools that I've never had to use before. I've had to learn blend modes that I've never had to use before. All right, simply because the subject matter is requesting something different from me that I just did not have the knowledge of. So as I started learning more about portrait retouching, I'm finding all these tools that are like, holy cow, I never knew, you know, Photoshop could do this. Okay. And like you guys, at first I'm like, yeah, all right, I'll just move this slider, I'll apply this layer effect and marvel at the results. But now I'm at the point where it says, okay, I need to get that subtlety between this layer effect and that layer effect, because this part of the image needs to handle it differently than this part of the image. All right. So being able to manipulate, these things on various parts of your image become very, very critical. All right. Also, if you are one of those that decides you want to go a little bit more experimental with your photography and start pushing the limits on the visual aspect, and you decide, well, I'm going to, change day to night. I'm going to create a fog bank here. I'm going to composite, this fantasy scene. At that point, you're doing heavy duty manipulation of the pixels. And at that point, you really need to have a better understanding of how the pixels you're adding interact with the pixels that are there. Okay? So again, it's just another tool in the toolbox. Any other questions?
The last thing I'll say is someone who's always trying to use Photoshop as Illustrator.
Oh, let me tell you.
That thing about the fill versus opacity on the text and that type of stuff. I've been looking for that.
You know what? I thought I heard a light bulb break at that point when I took the fill down on the text, leaving the shadow behind. That was your light bulb, wasn't it?
It could have been me too, because it's like, okay, what's this fill thing is? It makes no sense. It doesn't do anything. Now I know what it does.
Yeah, but for a graphic artist, oh my God, okay. That's an awesome tool. It really is. So, all right, guys. As I mentioned at the opening, we do have about 3 seats left for our workshop on the 17th, which is it's this Saturday in New Haven. Okay, even if if it's last minute, and you think maybe I'll come and visit Duck in New Haven. Most of you have my phone number. All right, just give me a ring and say, hey, any seats left open, and if there are, please join us. But we're trying to fill everything up. That way, the models are guaranteed their money, and everybody has a good time. And so
the link to pay is on your site.
Actually, Robert is handling the payment. And so you'll have to contact him. So I don't know what kind of arrangement you've made with him already. I know the two of you have been having some kind of conversation with that.
Yeah, so. I thought we just paid you.
No, this is actually Robert's gig. I'm just the instructor for the day, but it's his group, so I kind of let him handle that.
Okay.
So if it was my gig, totally different. I tend to be a little looser. Yeah, come on down. You can pay at the event. But he's only a little concerned because we are hiring 2 models for the day, and he just wants to make sure that gets covered. So, which I can understand. Okay.
Thank you, Doc.
All righty, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks much.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Have a good
Doc.
one.
And we are out.
Thank you for watching Learning Photography with Duck. Brought to you in association with Milford Photo, your local full-service camera store. Located in downtown Milford, Connecticut, Milford Photo offers you a personalized shopping experience. From the latest camera gear to printing and framing services. And, of course, educational workshops to teach you the finer aspects of photography. Don't forget to tell them Duck sent you.